I have the pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker, Phil Fontaine. He is the former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Phil Fontaine is an advocate for the future of Canada and for Indigenous peoples. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission credits him for placing the issue of residential schools on the national agenda when in October in 1990, he spoke publicly about the abuse that he and fellow students had experienced at the Fort Alexander Residential School. In 2005, he successfully negotiated with the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which included a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2009, he met Pope Benedict XVI to obtain an apology for abuses that occurred in First Nations school. Please welcome Phil Fontaine.
Thank you so much. That is quite a welcome. It warms my heart. And I want to say how honored I am to be here this morning. This particular event was preceded last night with a wonderful dinner and conversation with the president and invited guests. And the conversation that we had last night was very much centered on reconciliation. And it clearly ties in with the talk that I want to, or the things that I want to say and share with you this morning. A couple things before I start. My late aunt was married to my late father's older brother, was Emily MacLeod from L'Orange, Stanley Mission. And so when I was growing up, I heard a lot about L'Orange and Stanley Mission. And so I had occasion to actually visit L'Orange and Stanley Mission, and on one of those occasions we met with His Honor at a meeting with Chief Tammy Cook-Surson. So it was a real pleasure to listen to His Honor's story. It was empowering. And thank you, sir, for sharing with us this morning. And I believe this is the second one that I've done like this. I was at one other event similar to this with Mr. Arcand and Blaine Favel. I think it might have been organized by Blaine. Is that correct? Or sort of in Edmonton. Was it Winnipeg? Winnipeg. Edmonton, yeah. And, pardon? University of Alberta, yes, that's correct. And when I was finished my presentation, Eugene said, he didn't confront me, but he said, how come you kept looking at me while you talked? Well, I had to focus on something, right? To keep my mind off other things that I wanted to share. And it was actually very helpful, Eugene, that you were present. And Eugene was actually very involved with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its aftermath. And I distinctly remember the event in Montreal where the TRC and the 94 calls to action were brought before the public. And there are a number of speakers at the event, including, of course, the three commissioners, Justice Sinclair and Chief Littlechild and Marie Wilson. And it was a full house, standing room only. And the commissioners were all on stage. They were going to be presented. And I was outside the room. I think I was getting a coffee, and someone came to get me in kind of a panic. Actually, it was my niece, Lorena, said, "Hey, you're wanted in front. Eugene Arcan is asking for you." And so I walked to the front, and Eugene, in fact, was there. And he had placed a chair right in the middle of the stage beside the three commissioners. And he insisted that I sit in that chair. And he may have expressed his opinion only to me. He said, "You know, you have to be there. You made this thing happen." And so there I was. I sat in the middle, and the event proceeds. The commissioners speak. No one makes any reference to this interloper that's sitting on stage on the left, to the left of that. And someone, maybe more than one, was wondering, why was I up there? And why was Fontaine there like a wallflower? Because no one said a thing about my presence. Not that they had to, not that they were compelled to do so, but my presence on that stage spoke volumes, at least to me, about the TRC, the 94 calls to action, and how all of that came to pass. And Eugene Arcan, my dear friend, made that point to me. So I had no qualms about sitting on stage and being present in the way I was that morning. It meant so much to me and the people that had been central to the very difficult work that went into making sure that the TRC became a central part of our being today, because I was just at a meeting yesterday morning, very early, with primarily oil and gas people, and you wouldn't expect oil and gas people to ask the questions they did or to make the points that were expressed at this breakfast meeting, but one of the participants there made the point that reconciliation was the most important conversation taking place in Canada these days. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action was really all about ensuring that there was this Canada-wide conversation about a significant part of Canada's history that was missing in the lives of too many Canadians, particularly in schools, whether we were talking about high schools, elementary schools, colleges, and universities. I mean, in the good old days, when this is not very long ago, no one ever mentioned residential schools, the residential school experience, this tragic chapter in Canadian history. And it is recent history that this has become very central to our existence together as Canadians, to be able to finally know and understand the true history of Canada. Because what we learned before this moment was a distorted view of Canada. Distorted because what we learned about ourselves, as I include Indigenous peoples in this, was clearly not the truth. It was not even half the truth. right? There was so much missing. And so finally, we've offered Canadians an opportunity to learn about themselves, to know their history, their true history, and what this means to them as citizens of this country, and more importantly, what it means to Canada as a nation state and how it presents itself to the world. Because now, finally, it has an opportunity to present itself as it truly is. And that includes the hurt it inflicted on innocent people for about 100 years. People that were not deserving to be treated the way they were. No one deserves to be treated the way so many, 150,000 probably, young, innocent children that were abused unnecessarily and for too long. Just a second, I just remembered something. We were presented with a stool, and each of the speakers was to bring it up here, and I forgot the stone. And maybe I said maybe that's one of the reasons I'm struggling a bit with my presence here this morning. So to pick up on what I was saying, so here we are. We're part of this new conversation, and sometimes it's extremely difficult to talk about personal experiences as much as they matter to the discussion at hand. But we have to be strong. We have to be determined. We have to be committed to sharing these stories so that people understand a lot better than they do, but why people have been the way they've been for too long. So what I'd like to do is share a bit of my own story and how that experience enabled me to carry out my duties and responsibilities in various positions that I've held in my short life. And I should point out one thing, not important, largely unimportant, but I was having breakfast with this Korean woman in Vancouver a couple of summers ago. And I was late, as I often am, for breakfast, and she hadn't started eating the food in front of her. And she said, and I asked her, why haven't you, started breakfast? She said, well, in Korean culture, we don't eat before our elders. And so I've waited for you. And that's the first time someone had ever noted that, like overnight, I'd become an elder, right? Because I've never, ever considered myself an elder, and apparently I am. And I appreciate the presenters this morning that they didn't say, now welcome Elder Fontaine. I'm not that proud, actually. Anyway, a bit about myself. I come from Saguin, formerly known as Fort Alexander, the Indian Reserve. It's an Ojibwe community situated at the mouth of the Winnipeg River. And it's a fairly large First Nation community, close to 9,000 people. And that's where I was born, that's where I grew up. And I might mention in a fairly large family, 12 There were 10 boys, 2 girls. I was the 10th boy, and then my younger sisters. There are 4 of us left. A brother, Bert, who's going to be 83, myself, and 2 younger sisters. And every one of us, excluding the 2 siblings, brothers, that died at a young age, all of us were residential school survivors. And that included Mom and Dad that attended the same residential school I entered when I was 6, and our grandmother on my father's side that attended an industrial school in St. Boniface. So we have years and years of residential school experience. And as I said, I entered when I was 6. Our father died in the first year of residential school. I entered September. He passed on in February. So our mother was destined to assume this burden of raising 10 children. And she was a determined woman. For those of you that know a bit about the Indian Act, and we had a good discussion last night, there was a major revision or amendment to the Indian Act in 1951. And so that Indian Act, that revised Indian Act, made it possible finally for Indian women, as known then, to assume public office and our mother was elected to council June 1952. And she received the Coronation Medal for being the first Indian woman to be elected to a band council. I realized that there are a lot of firsts, but for us, that was so very important. You know, she was a widow, a young widow, about 40, and she had taken on these added responsibilities of being a council member in 1952. And she had no guidebook to help her figure out how to be a councillor. She just knew that she had to use her presence and her voice to advocate for the community, primarily women, by the way. And we were extremely proud of our mom. And she was always the most important reference point in my life as I grew up. No father, so she was both mom and dad to us, and she was an absolutely incredible force, not just in our family, but in our community. And I thank my lucky stars that my mom was with us for as long as she was. And so when I decided to take on other responsibilities as I went on, for example, to be band manager, as we were called then, this position now in many communities would be described as CEO. It had in large measure to do with our mother and her insistence that I take on this responsibility, and that led me to run for position of chief in Saugeen. I was nominated at 27 to be chief, elected at 28, right? And I served for 4 years, and I had no idea, really, to be quite honest with you, as to what I was expected to do other than to introduce some change to the way the community was progressing or not progressing. And so Saugeen became the first community in Canada to take on this notion of local control. Self-government, as we would describe it today, or self-rule, but modeled very much, I said the first, but actually it was Walpole Island that was the very first community in Canada to begin this process of self-rule or self-government. And that was in 1963. Right? And as I said, we modeled ourselves after Walpole Island. And so the very first decision of any, checking the time there, Kathleen, no? My timer. And so the very first important decision that we took as a community was to take over the education program. And we quite often reflect on that decision, and there's no more important decision that we could have ever taken than the one that resulted in our community running education in Saugeen. And that meant illegally firing all the teachers that were teaching in our community, because they weren't our employees, they were employees of the federal government, and we apparently had no right to fire them. But we made that decision because it placed us in a position to hire teachers that were qualified and certified, because we knew that many of the teaching staff were permit teachers, meaning they weren't certified, or they didn't carry the provincial certification that they were proper teachers. And it created quite a kerfuffle. And it made a huge difference for us. We were finally able to hire the people that we knew were good and wanted to be part of the community. We were able to become directly involved with the teacher education programs out of the University of Brandon. We talked about that last night, BUNTEP, Impact, PENT, and we sent a whole number of our people to go be educated as educators, teachers, and many of these people became principals and important people, not just in Saugeen, but in many other communities, in terms of furthering our position in education. So that was my grounding in terms of leadership positions that took me then to as Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and then National Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. But something always was like this black cloud in my life, and it plagued me for forever, really, if I can put it that way. And it was my experience in the residential school in Fort Alexander. And there was a reference made to this interview that I did with Barbara Frum, October 1990, when for the very first time, apparently, an Indigenous leader had taken on the responsibility of talking about personal experience of abuse in residential schools. But I must admit, I wasn't the first. I might have been the first to appear on national television, or the first to talk about my experience in different public fora. But it was because there were others, particularly in British Columbia, that had been so incredibly courageous. And those discussions and those disclosures made it possible for me to do what I did at that moment, not knowing in any way the consequences of this disclosure. I had no idea what impact it would have, but I just knew that I had to speak to this important part of not just my own experience, my personal experience, but the experience of many, many others. And I must point out that I didn't find it easy, because as I said, I didn't know. And I had not tested it, but I had raised this issue at a major Chiefs Assembly in Whitehorse. The Chiefs of Canada were gathered in Whitehorse to talk about the business at hand. And that included talking about our future, the vision for the future. And I had argued that it would be very difficult for us to talk about the future without ridding ourselves of this dark cloud that hung over our communities and was affecting very negatively the lives of so many individuals. And so I raised the issue of abuse in residential schools at that meeting. And I was chastised for doing so. And I was chastised for doing so. And I was reminded that Chiefs' Assemblies was not a place where you talked about abuse in residential schools. There were more important matters to be talked about. There was more important business to discuss. And I was a bit, taken aback by that. But I stood my ground. I carried on this conversation with this individual chief. And before we concluded our talk, he disclosed to me that he had been abused, right? And he had no interest, though, in talking about this in a public way. It was a private matter, and he wanted it to remain a private matter. And so, and in fact, he had suggested that someone should have written my speech that day. That was more in keeping with protocol and decorum at these assemblies. And had no idea what the protocol or decorum was supposed to be, other than we were compelled to talk about matters of great importance. And I thought this was something that had to be discussed. And but I knew I was right. I absolutely knew I was right. And for this one reason, and this is not expressed in any way arrogantly, but as I'd walked off the stage after I'd finished talking, not in the most articulate way, right, but talking nonetheless, I bumped into two women chiefs that I knew, and they were in tears. And I knew what schools they'd attended, and they were really overcome with emotion because it triggered so many memories and experiences in their own lives. And so it said to me that this was something that we had to talk about. It said to me that this was something that we needed to resolve in one way or another. And the only mistake that I made during the early days of this was going to a forum like this of journalists. And we were assured that whatever we said at that meeting was off the record. And you never say that with journalists and others. You never ask them whether this is off the record, because they'll undoubtedly share whatever was said. And I had been asked, well, what are you going to do? Because this was in Toronto. What are you going to do when you return to Winnipeg? What's your next step? I said, I'm going to go pay a visit to Archbishop Aku. It was, St. Boniface Diocese. They had domain over communities such as ours in the residential school there. And so I thought that this would be a private meeting. I went over to the Bishop's Palace in St. Boniface. The front entrance there was like all kinds of journalists, and I knew that I had made a mistake in Toronto. But nonetheless, I had paid my visit. We talked. I made the pitch to the Archbishop for some kind of public statement from the Archdiocese, statement of an apology, a process to record the history of residential schools. We didn't talk about money, not once, but really we talked about ensuring that whoever wanted to disclose would have that become part of the record. whether it's part of the public record or held in some place, a repository, where people could refer to those matters. And we had not an easy time, but we weren't spurned by the Archbishop. But it gave me a sense that this was going to be a rather difficult issue to pursue. But I sensed that we were on the right track. And so that then allowed me to start thinking about my own life. Because I had been bothered, so bothered for the longest time. And I shared this part of my life at the University of Manitoba, where my dear friend Eugene Arcand had spoken and introduced me there and said some very positive, reaffirming words to me, and that enabled me to talk to the extent that I did about my troubled life. And yeah, it was quite a moment. And I was blessed with the presence of my mom, not my mom, maybe her spirit, but with my son and daughter. They were in the audience when I talked about my behavior, my past behavior, my drunkenness. I've been an alcoholic, and I was not the most gentle soul that was out there. I was a pretty nasty person, actually. I didn't treat people well. They suffered my abuses unfairly and unnecessarily. And I had hurt especially my daughter Maya, my son Mike, because I essentially abandoned my family as I carried on with my crazy life. And I was chief then, for 4 years. And that didn't seem to deter me from living this craziness. And they came up to the stage, these two beautiful people. And both hugged me publicly. And that was pretty special for me, right? Because they could have been angry, they could have disowned me, they could have told me that they were embarrassed by what they learned from my presentation that day. Because I hadn't shared it with them, but they knew that I hadn't been good. I hadn't been good to them. I hadn't been good to my family. And so I managed to make my way through that day. And it was very much like the day after I had made the public disclosure, when I never felt so alone in my life, because it seemed that I had discredited so many people by talking about something that was personal and hurtful and shameful. And no one wanted to hear anything about that kind of talk. And but I put the two together, and I got some peace out of that. Right? I got some peace out of that, and I've been forever grateful that the people that supported me in 1990 and after, and my son and daughter and others that accepted me a lot better and more positively than I accepted myself as an individual. That meant so much to me. And I felt, as I do here, empowered by those special moments, because they affected me in such a profound way, and I'm forever thankful. So, not giving you a detail, I don't think you want. It's necessary for me to tell you details about my life, other than in general terms, as I have here, that I've been no different than many in our community that have been so affected by the residential school experience. Terrible, terrible memories. And it's like Eugene said the other day, years and years of trying to forget. And you have this moment where you have to remember these terrible memories. And it's hurtful, right? And we haven't quite figured out together how we can make it easier for people that have been so affected, to make it possible for those people to talk in a way that is more reassuring, more reaffirming than we've been able to construct up to this time. The closest we've come to that, and I congratulate and thank those people that were very involved in the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that long process of going out and reaching out to people, including survivors that were willing to tell their stories for posterity, right, to become part of the public record. That was a very challenging piece of work, but those people have done us enormous good, because now here we are, 30 such event, we are able to talk about something that is probably, as I said, as expressed at this breakfast meeting, the most important conversation that that Canadians are engaged in now and will be engaged in for years to come. Because I was asked, because this assertion has been made, reconciliation is dead. Reconciliation is dead because of what is happening on the West Coast with the āsohtētān, the protests and blockades in Tyendinaga and other places. People are down, right? The Prime Minister misspoke. He was not truthful when he said the most important relationship to him was with Indigenous peoples, and his commitment to reconciliation has been completely undermined by what has happened in various parts of the country. And my position was, as I've heard it here and last night, is that reconciliation is a long journey, and a conversation that's going to go on for years and years. And the success of that process is very much dependent on our willingness to open up our minds, open up our hearts, and accept whatever differences exist between people. Accept them as important to one's self, that those differences don't set us apart, but actually make it possible for us to work together, right? We're a small minority in Canada, about 4%, I believe, of the Canadian population. But I would venture that the most incredible force at the moment in Canada, in terms of transformative change, in making Canada a better place than it's been, and a country that's good for all people, are Indigenous peoples. And we will lead this process of transformative change through moments like this one today, and speaking the truth about the 94 calls to action with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal, not the Royal Commission, what the hell am I talking about? The Truth and Reconciliation, because the RCAP had 440 recommendations, right? And I don't know how many of them have been implemented other than this chapter, this single chapter on residential schools that has brought us here. Important. But in the main, those recommendations are gathering dust on some government shelf in Ottawa and elsewhere. But this one, the TRC, the 94 calls to action, are alive and well. And they're driving this change that we all so desperately need. And we are going to get there, I tell you. And that's as exciting for me as anything that is before me. And we have so many good people to thank for their incredible work, including my dear friend's contribution, Mr. Eugene Arcan. And people like him go unnoticed, right? And we don't express our thanks and appreciation to people like him often enough. And he deserves our admiration. And so, my dear friends, I thank you so much for being so kind to me here this morning, being so patient, and allowing me to speak as I have, a little bit all over the place, desultory in some respects about my opinions and perspectives, but nonetheless truthfully spoken. And so thank you so much. I appreciate all of you. My admiration to all of you good people that are involved in this incredible struggle. And to say to his honor that I was not just impressed, but I was moved by your sharing your story. It was a story of accomplishment, a story of a commitment, of drive, and most importantly, the incredible importance of grandparents, right? Grandma and grandfather. Amazing. Thank you so much, Miigwech.